Good morning, Key West. I'm Geraldine Brooks, and as some of you who are astute observers may realize, this is not Marlon James. Some of you have this page in your handy guidebook, and some of you don't. And this page is unfortunately titled Addenda and Errata. This is not an addenda or errata. It is my great friend and colleague, Nicole Galland. We're not going to discuss a massive first volume of a trilogy fantasy about Africa this morning, because that's about the only kind of thing Nicole Galland hasn't yet written. We will talk about her journey from stage to page, and we will talk a little bit about my work in historical fiction and the hardwood forests of fact, where I started out my writing career. And then we'll have a little Shakespeare. So take it away, Nikki.
Oh, good morning. I'm going to start, now that Geraldine has introduced me, I'm going to introduce Geraldine, who will then introduce me. It's a positive feedback loop. I'm going to tell you a few facts that you may or may not know about my friend Geraldine, and then pester her with some questions that are thematically related to the conference. Geraldine, as many of you may have guessed from her accent, is not from America. She was born in Sydney and grew up there and began her career in journalism, which is, as I understand it, what she always wanted to do. And she did it with gusto. After majoring in art history and government, she went to Columbia for journalism, Columbia University, in the journalism program, where she met her husband, Tony Horwitz, who's also a journalist. And they spent a number of years as foreign correspondents in the Middle East, tackling some pretty intense places and dealing with some very harsh realities. She took a leave of absence to write a book that was a nonfiction book called 9 Parts of Desire, which is a beautiful examination of the different ways to be a woman in the Muslim world. And also wrote a memoir that I adore called Foreign Correspondence. In the midst of all that, she also managed to get herself arrested in Nigeria. Once they had returned to the United States, Geraldine was doing journalism work for the UN, and I would love to hear a bit about that. But what struck me when we were discussing this is that she is more than maybe any of the other characters of the weekend. She really lived the hero's journey, because there was a separation and an ordeal and a reintegration into her own life, which made her realize that she maybe should stay home and write some more books. What was different, it was that she then began to write novels. Her first one was Year of Wonders. I think the second one was March. Yep. I wrote this all very neatly, which won the Pulitzer Prize, as I'm sure that many of you know. She's also written People of the Book, Caleb's Crossing, and The Secret Chord, all of which are magnificent works of historical fiction. And that brings us up to the moment where I'm going to start asking you questions. The first one, which I'm always fascinated by, is that after years in the trenches of dealing with reality in journalism, and even in your nonfiction books, what led to the transition to novels, not just the inspiration for the first novel, which I'd love to hear about, but that you continued to stay in the fiction vein?
So as you said, I always wanted to be a journalist, and I think I can date the moment that it occurred to me that that was what I should do very precisely, because I went to visit my dad where he worked for the first time when I was 8 years old, and he was a proofreader at the Sydney newspaper. And isn't that quaint? We don't have proofreaders anymore, alas. And I got there just as the afternoon edition was about to roll, and we don't have afternoon editions anymore, and barely newspapers, which is very sad. But when the presses rolled, it was a physical sensation. The air was inky, you could smell it, and the noise was incredible, but the vibration coming up through the floor as this giant roll of newsprint blurred across the room, and he reached down onto the conveyor and grabbed a paper and handed it to me, and it was warm. It was hot off the presses. And I looked down to read the news of the political scandal of the day, and I thought, I'm the first person in the city who knows what's going on right now. And I wanted to be part of that. So I traveled so happily through my career, and I never thought about doing anything else. And I probably never would have become a novelist if it wasn't for the Nigerian secret police. I was in Nigeria reporting on how the very corrupt military dictatorship of Sani Abacha was in cahoots with Shell Oil to oppress and massacre the impoverished subsistence farmers of the Niger Delta, where all the oil wealth came from. And I had gone around gathering evidence that indeed unarmed farmers had been massacred at Shell's behest. They'd called in the military against these peaceful protesters. And then, as you do as a journalist, I went to get the military side of the story. And instead of giving me an interview, they gave me to the secret police, and they threw me in a unlovely lock-up in the town of Port Harcourt. And I remember the first night lying on the concrete floor and thinking of all the journalists who'd been detained. And I thought about some Middle East correspondents who were detained for up to 8 years. And I went, 8 years. I'm 38 years old. 8 years. I forgot to get pregnant. And lucky for me, they deported me after 3 days, so I went home and greeted Tony with more than usual enthusiasm. And our son was born the following year. And I needed a new gig, and that's how I found the courage to unpick the true story of what had happened in this little English village. And it had been banging around in my head since we'd stumbled into this place, and it was the story of how a village took the unique decision in 1665 to quarantine itself rather than do what every other single community did when the plague arrived, which was run and spread the infection. So they took this decision of self-sacrifice. And I wondered what that was like. And it's that, what was it like to be them question that I think always animates my fiction and keeps me coming back to it.
Which you do so well. So you've stolen, no.
Yes.
You've adapted, you've borrowed from history and also from fiction, but you recently had the audacity to do that with the Bible.
Oh, we all steal from the Bible. Actually, I remember a conversation we had. This was a book called The Secret Chord, which is a reimagining of the life of King David, just opening up that incredible story and letting it breathe a bit more and letting the women have more say, because unlike most stories in the Bible, there are really vivid women characters in David's story, but their stories are very abbreviated. You know, in the Bible, women get a really lousy deal. I mean, Lot's wife, Gladys, Frances, Maud, she doesn't even get a name. Neither does Noah's wife. But in David's story, the women do get names, and they get these wonderful little sketches, but they're in there only for how they impact on David and how he impacts them and what was going on before and after their lives intersect. Nothing is said, so that's why I wanted to. But, you know, everybody steals from the Bible, and you read the book and you said you stole that bit about him escaping out the bedroom window on a bedsheet from Shakespeare.
From Shakespeare.
And I said, no, Shakespeare stole that from the Bible. Because that's David's running away from Saul at one point, and his wife ties the sheets together, and out he goes. So, and we were trying to brainstorm all the titles that are stolen from the Bible. The sun also rises. Absalom, Absalom, through a glass darkly.
The Book of David? The Book of David. Yes?
Daniel.
The Book of Daniel.
Yeah. Anybody else got any? Speak? No?
No.
Anyway, it's rich pickings. These are great archetypes that, I think most of the Old Testament is a story of a dysfunctional family that just goes on and on and on. And David, I think, is our first political biography, is the first man in history that we know from soup to nuts, from early childhood to extreme old age. And absolutely everything that can happen to a human being, the best and the worst, happens to him. And so I decided to go there, and that book is The Secret Chord.
You converted to the Jewish faith, and did you ever feel that anything in the Bible or anything that you wanted to talk about, was there ever any conflict between your identity as a Jew and your relationship to the Jewish Bible?
No,
nothing was off limits, or
my conversion was more about history than about religion. My dad served in what was then Mandate Palestine during World War II, and he was a commie, essentially, and he just loved the kibbutz movement, and he thought that might be an answer for human nature, and he came back as a kind of ardent lefty Zionist, and he was a kind of hard man to know, but that was a way to connect with him, and I became really interested in Jewish history as a result of that. And then, I even, to the extent that, I was going to a Catholic girls' school where we had a school uniform. We were very formal in Australia with hats and gloves and the whole 9 yards, and I started wearing a Star of David. Much to the consternation of the good Sisters of Charity, but they were terrific women, really. They really respected women's intellectual exploration, thank God, So they let me carry my obsession to the point where I wrote a play about the Warsaw Ghetto and made the young woman from Lithuania play the Nazi. Anyway, moving along, I managed to get a scholarship to Columbia University in my late 20s and met a man named Horwitz, not realizing that was a Jewish name, because I forgot to mention that I'd never met a Jew, even though there are some Jews in Sydney, but they lived on the right side of the tracks, and we were kind of on the wrong side of the tracks. So I had never actually met a Jewish person, despite my obsession. So I didn't know. And then suddenly I saw it on a big box of matzah, and I thought, oh, maybe he's Jewish. And sure enough, he was. And then when we decided to get married, there was no way I was going to be the end of the line for a Jewish lineage that had survived everything to get to that point. So it was a no-brainer to convert. So no, I was not inhibited about the Bible.
Excellent. That's a beautiful story. I'm glad I asked. So moving on to a different book and sort of shifting from adaptation to archetype, Caleb's Crossing, which is set on Martha's Vineyard around the same time as your Wonders, but
yes,
a different...
it's a great period, actually. I love that sort of 1660s, 1670s, because it's where you feel the medieval mind giving way to the modern mind. It's the first point after, I think we can relate somewhat to the Romans, unfortunately. But, we were just talking about Horace, and Horace writes wonderfully about how annoying it is that all the people are coming to his lovely bit of the countryside and tearing down the perfectly nice, modest villas and putting up McMansion villas. And I really relate to Horace, but you can feel superstition giving way to science, because they're still, hanging witches in Scotland, but they're also inventing calculus in Cambridge at that time. And the humor is relatable, and their cynicism is relatable, because they've had the whole upheaval of having killed a king, tried something else, that didn't work, and now we're, we're going back to the other. So who wouldn't be cynical in that situation? So I really love that period, and I had, Year of Wonders, so I knew what was going on in England, and it was a product of moving to the vineyard as a year-rounder. As you Key Westers appreciate the beauty of a place that you come to, and I wonder if any of you here who are here in the winter ever look at each other over a nice meal and say, I wonder what it's like here in the summer. So that was what I did. Tony and I loved the vineyard, and we would rent a shack up island for a week or two, whatever we could afford when we were students, and then later when we came back from being foreign correspondents. And at some point every single summer we'd say, I wonder what it's like here in winter. And then finally 12 years ago, we found out. And I was interested in how, you come to the end of the summer season and it's like somebody picks up the island from Chappaquiddick in one hand and Aquinnah in the other, flips it over and shakes it, and a whole lot of people fall off, and then you look around and you see who your neighbors really are. And so for the first time I had Native American neighbors, and I wanted to learn more about the Wampanoag culture and history, and the tribe is they're fantastic custodians of that. So I went up island and got their materials, and one was a map with all the significant places to the tribe, and one note said birthplace of the first Native American graduate of Harvard. And I thought, how cool, maybe I'll meet him at the farmer's market. Because I thought that bastion of white male super privilege wouldn't have opened its doors to a Native American maybe till 1965. Well, I was off by a few hundred years because it was 1665 when he graduated. And again, it was, what was it like to be him? How did that happen? So that was my island book, and now we're going to turn the tables and talk about your most recent book. So Nikki was raised on Martha's Vineyard and is a proud graduate of Martha's Vineyard Regional High School, where she was a valedictorian. She went off to Harvard and got
Just
an honors,
like Caleb.
just like Caleb, and got an honors degree in comparative religions. So we have a lot to talk about before we even start on literature. But she has been an oscillator between the stage and the page for much of her career. She was an actor all through school and college, and then after graduation went off to be the dramaturg for Berkeley Rep and worked with Circle Rep and many other theater companies on the East and West Coast, acting, script doctoring, and finally I met Nikki because she is the co-founder of a wonderful program called Shakespeare for the Masses, which is a winter joy on the vineyard. Nikki and her accomplices take Shakespeare's plays and boil them down to the best 1 hour bits and then perform those bits. And Nikki does the connective tissue narration. And it's always packed, and it's a great way to introduce your kids to Shakespeare because they can sit there for an hour and get the best bits, and then they'll return to the play. But Nikki has now done something that's very dangerous to do when you live in a small community, which is written about it. So can you tell us about the courage to write
Oh, sure.
on the same page?
On the same page, thank you, which just came out a couple of weeks ago, which is why we're bringing it to the conversation. It's set on Martha's Vineyard in the winter, and it is I don't want to say autobiographical, but it's biographical in the sense that it reflects what the vineyard's really like in the off-season, including 2 privately owned newspapers that hate each other and that have a sort of a Cold War going on. It would not on its surface seem to be Shakespearean in any way, except that the protagonist is a woman who, like most of Shakespeare's comedic heroines, has to put on a separate identity. She is one person and has to pretend to be another person in order to get by in a difficult situation. So even if I'm not thinking consciously about Shakespeare, it just sort of seems to fall into the little cracks in my brain where the creative stuff happens that I'm not consciously aware of. The 97% that Joyce Carol Oates was talking about the other day gets filled with Shakespeare when I'm not looking.
So that's your default.
That's my default. My default is Shakespeare, yeah.
Can you talk about how being a Shakespeare geek led you to your first novel? The Fool's Tale.
Oh, sure, yeah. I grew up reading Shakespeare before we were studying it in school or anything, which I don't actually recommend because Shakespeare was written to be seen and heard and not read, unless the poetry, but that's a different thing altogether. And I became entranced with the fools. I just was obsessed with the fools and this sort of archetype of the fools. And obviously, if you're looking at the archetype of the fool, you end up looking at the archetype of the king as well, because they're the same side of this, they're opposite sides of the same coin because they are so diametrically opposed. And my first novel is called The Fool's Tale because I just took that dichotomy and dove in as deep as I could. So that is not overtly Shakespearean, but I wouldn't have gotten there if Shakespeare hadn't made me fall in love with Feste and Lear's Fool and Touchstone.
And so what do you do with your fool?
In the Fool's Tale?
Yeah.
Oh.
Not in your marriage.
Part of the reason that she's saying that is that friends of mine who are very familiar with the Fool's Tale, when they met my husband, said, "Isn't that extraordinary? You created Gwirion and then you married him." Sadly, it turns out that is not a sustainable model, but he's very subversive. He's subversive and he's mischievous, and he is constantly testing the boundaries of what the fairly tyrannical man in charge is able to do. So sort of what the late night comedians are doing these days. They're the court jesters, I think, of America right now, and thank God for them.
Yeah. So what was it like making the transition from the stage to the page? How did that work for you?
Oh, yeah, I backed into that. I was an actor, and I got into trouble. First of all, you have no sense of agency when you're an actor. You take whatever the role is that's offered to you because you're desperate for the next paycheck. So you don't have control over who you're on stage with, who's telling you what to do, or what words have to come out of your mouth. And I'm a control freak, so that was difficult. So I decided to become a stage director. And at that point, I'm so delighted that this is no longer the case, but at that point there was kind of a glass ceiling for women directors. And also, if you're a control freak, you can't control what your actors do once the curtain's gone up. You can rehearse things 1,000 times the same way, and then they're just going to do what they're going to do. So then I thought, well, one way to both make more money and also to have more control is to become a screen director. That's what I'll do. So I decided to become a movie director, and I bought all the little how to become a movie director books.
And that works.
And the thing that all of them said was the hardest thing is finding the right material to film for your first movie, because who's going to give you their screenplay when you don't have a track record? And I thought, well, that's easy. I'll just write something. So I wrote something which was set on the vineyard, actually, in the 40s. It was the story of my grandparents' illicit romance called The Winter Population. And then I could never raise the money or get the wherewithal to actually get it made, but there was a screenwriting competition that had this is what the entry fee was, and that's how much I had to spend on an entry fee. So I submitted it, and I won. And all of a sudden, I had Susan Sarandon was attached to the project, and Luis Mandoki was going to direct it, and they had $20 million in offshore financing, and I had an agent, and I thought, wow, that was easy. Now I'm going to be a screenwriter. So I moved out to LA, because that's where you have to live to be a screenwriter, and immediately the project fell apart completely for political reasons. So the thing that's so weird, I think screenwriting is the only creative art where you get paid to do nothing. Or you do stuff and then nothing ever happens. So for several years, I made a living writing stuff that was never going to get seen by anybody. And I was so miserable, and I holed up in my boyfriend's house in the high desert and went back to this idea that I had had for The Fool's Tale back in college when I was in my, I love Shakespeare and I love fools and that's all I want to do. But somehow I talked myself out of writing that, and now there was nothing else I could do. So I wrote it in this intense, 3-month period, finished the first draft. And then it's a completely different story that goes on forever that I won't go into now, but the sequence of events that went from finishing the first draft to finishing the third draft is like would make its own movie. It's just things, the synchronicity and the serendipity is sort of out of this world. And then my agent showed it to a literary agent who picked it up and sold it 10 days after she got it. And I thought, oh, well, that wasn't easy, but maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. And finally, I have complete control over everything, so the control freak is happy.
And it was a Discover Young Writers
and
selection.
Yes, it was Barnes & Noble made it a Discover New Writers selection. And then I was that's when I was actually working at Berkeley Rep running the literary department, and my agent called me one day right before The Fool's Tale came out and said, what's your salary at Berkeley Rep? And I said, why? And she said, well, they're about to offer you a 2-book deal, and I want them to offer you more than you'd get at Berkeley Rep so that you'll quit your job. And that's what happened, pretty much.
And you do, we've heard a lot already this weekend, and I'm sure we'll hear more about how people research their work, but I think that you take research to a whole new level when you wrote Godiva.
No.
And she rode naked on a horse.
Just so I'd know what it feels like.
And what does it feel like?
It feels good. I was a method actor, so now I'm a method writer.
But before On the Same Page, your most recent work, and you call On the Same Page a palate cleanser between...
Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you.
Tell about The Rise and
Fall of Dodo is a novel that I co-wrote with Neil Stephenson, and it is about time travel, which is why I'm so delighted that there's other stuff about time travel this weekend. It's nice to see the book on the pile with similarly themed books. And it is about the tension between magic and technology, in a sense, and a little government bureaucracy thrown in for fun. And when we were writing, about halfway through our working on it, we both knew that a sequel was called for. And Neil, I had an idea for an historical novel that was all about Shakespeare. And Neil said, you should adapt that a little bit and make it the sequel to Dodo, because that would be awesome. So Dodo came out. We finished it, The Rise and Fall of Dodo, we finished it, and while we were waiting to see how it would be received, the publisher said, we're totally on board for the sequel, but we don't want to offer you a contract until we know how Dodo does. So do a little, let's do a little project in the middle. And what I should have done if I was thinking about branding myself efficiently, which I'm a total failure at doing, is I should have said, well, how about another speculative fiction thing that I can, write in 6 months or something. But instead I said, well, I've had this idea kicking around for this romantic comedy set on Martha's Vineyard. How about it? And to my amazement, they said yes. So it was fun to do it. And it really did feel like a palate cleanser, because now I'm in the weeds of the Dodo sequel. So I'm in my happy place, because the primary plot line is 1606 London, while Shakespeare is writing some of his greatest works, especially one that I can't name because we're in a theater. The Scottish play. So a lot of it is to do with the Scottish play. So again, witches and people in power and stuff.
For those of us who don't know, why is that a thing that you can't mention that play in a theater?
There's different theories, but the original, the oldest one that we know of, I mean, it's all apocryphal. Who knows? It's just actors love being superstitious, so we'll leap at any opportunity to, be high maintenance that way. But the one theory or one belief is that Shakespeare used actual witches' spells, and they were annoyed about that, so they put a curse on the play, which is why supposedly in many of the early productions of the play, horrible mishaps would happen. I don't know if that's true or not, but in what's going to happen in the Dodo sequel, this is not a spoiler. That's a big part of it, is witches trying to make sure that there actually are magical spells, and what he just thought was nonsense poetry.
Huh, that's terrific. I love that. But they didn't put a very effective curse, seeing that it is probably the most popular and most performed. Yes. I mean, as curses
well,
go.
I think Hamlet beats that. But do you know that at any moment, every single moment, 24/7, somewhere in the world, there is a production of Hamlet either being rehearsed or performed.
Yeah, so, yeah, they need to go back to their spell book, I reckon.
Yeah, they got that wrong.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what we're doing time-wise.
How are we
but
time-wise? We don't want to miss the
how many minutes have we got? How many?
15. Should we do it?
Well,
I'll
you've
set
got to
it up
talk
and-
about, the book of yours that most relates to the theme of this conference is
Iago?
Iago.
Yes, Iago, which,
Yeah.
spoiler, is stolen from Shakespeare. When as part of Shakespeare for the Masses, we were working on Othello, and Billy Milady, who then became my husband and my fool, came down to the island to play Iago, and he had never read Othello, which is extraordinary to me, but the way that we do Shakespeare for the Masses is we have one day of rehearsal, and then we do it as a script in hand thing. So he had said he wanted to play Iago, and then he came down and admitted that he'd never read the play. And I said, well, why did you say you wanted to play Iago? And he said, I'm not an idiot. Everyone wants to play Iago. I just don't know why. So we had this panic attack, and we stayed up till 2 a.m. reading through it, and he asked me these really great questions that we didn't quite have time to go into in detail because we had one day of rehearsal. But after we had done the show and then he left, I kept thinking about some of the questions that he asked. They were really good questions. And thinking about them led me to write the story of Othello from Iago's point of view, in which he is not the villain that he is in Shakespeare. He's a good man who becomes a bad man and doesn't realize it until it's too late to fix the problem. And as audacious as it might sound to claim this, you can go through the text, and the text actually supports that if you look at sort of what's hidden underneath it. So anyway, when by the time the book came out, I had married Billy, and therefore when we did the book tour, we did this fun little thing of doing a scene from the play, just the two of us, to demonstrate, which is why Geraldine thought this would be a fun thing to add to our talk, since it really fits the theme of this entire conference, the malleability of the source material, how whatever it is that we choose, the writers will already know this, and I think maybe now everyone else can start to appreciate it as well, but to see it instead of just hearing about it, that you can take whatever the source material is and really put your own very personal stamp on it. So in my case, I had to do that because I had to justify turning Shakespeare's most notorious villain into the protagonist of a novel that you wouldn't want to throw across the room. And so this scene is a 1-minute scene between Iago and his wife Emilia. They're the secondary couple in the play. I don't want to assume that everyone knows the plot, so just very quickly, Othello and Desdemona. Othello is a Moor, which could mean a lot of things, but is generally interpreted to mean that he is African. And he is in Venice, and he runs off with a patrician's daughter. His second in command is Iago. Her second in command, her lady-in-waiting, Emilia, are married to each other. And the handkerchief, almost everybody knows that Desdemona has a handkerchief, even if they don't know what else happens in the play. Emilia finds Desdemona's handkerchief, gives it to Iago, which both allows Iago to create a lot of mischief, but also allows Emilia to unmask Iago at the end of the play. So Desdemona and Othello's relationship is very, very clearly one of great passion in a way that is subversive and subverts the patriarchal order, literally the patrician order of Venice. But Emilia and Iago, it's far more open to interpretation. There is a 1-minute scene between them where they're alone on stage, and it's the only opportunity that you have to see what that relationship consists of. And it's really important because that relationship is, Othello and Desdemona, their relationship is what starts the play, but Iago and Emilia's relationship is what ends the play. So you have 1 minute, or maybe a minute and a half if you add Emilia's speech at the beginning of it, to get any sense whatsoever of who these people are. Generally, it's not considered a happy marriage because, spoiler, he kills her, murders her at the end. So you know that if you know that, you go in with certain assumptions. So because of that, it's generally not played as a very amicable relationship. And so Geraldine has agreed to be my husband. And we are going to attempt to recreate don't try this at home, a somewhat exaggerated version. We're going to be looking at the spectrum of things here, but a somewhat exaggerated but not unfaithful version of how the relationship is often played.
And to me, the first time I saw Nikki and Billy do this, I thought, that is so great, because exactly the same words can have a completely different meaning. And to me, it mirrors the great truth of the relationship between the novelist and the reader, because every person who picks up a book will read it a different way. And the same person can read a book a different way depending on what's happening in their life when they read and reread it. And that's the magic of it, because you never know what book you've written in somebody else's reading. So,
all right. We've done like 20 minutes of rehearsal for this. And we just added the speech at the last minute, so I'm not even sure that I'll get it right, but indulge us. So this is Emilia and Iago as it is frequently interpreted. I'm glad I found this napkin. This was her first remembrance from the moor. My wayward husband hath 100 times wooed me to steal it, but she so loves the token, for he conjured her she should ever keep it, that she reserves it evermore about herself to kiss and talk to. I'll give it Iago. What he will do with it, heaven knows, not I. I nothing but to please his fancy.
how now? What do you here alone?
Do not you chide. I have a thing for you.
A thing for me? It is a common thing to have a foolish wife.
Oh, is that all? What will you give me now for that same handkerchief?
What handkerchief?
What handkerchief? What, that which the Moor first gave to Desdemona? That which so often you did bid me steal?
Thou stolst it from her?
No, in faith, she let it drop by negligence, and to the advantage I being here, took it up. Look, here it is.
Good wench, give it me.
What will you do with it that you have been so earnest to have me filch it?
Why? What's that to you?
Give it me again. Poor lady, she shall run mad when she shall lack it.
I have a use for it. Go now, leave me.
So that's how it's usually done, or some variation of that.
Not quite so hammy.
But when I was in high school, my acting teacher, who had never read the play as literature but had played Emilia, said to us, Shakespeare never wrote any entirely evil characters. Even Iago, who's the one who's usually considered evil, has the saving grace that he genuinely loves his wife. So I came to Othello with the presumption, the very first time that I ever read it or saw it, that of course Iago genuinely loves his wife, which the text actually supports. So the same exact scene can be played like this. I'm glad I found this napkin. This was her first remembrance from the moor. My wayward husband hath 100 times wooed me to steal it. She so loves the token, for he conjured her to keep it, that she evermore reserves it about her to kiss and talk to. I'll give it Iago. What he will do with it, heaven knows, not I. I nothing but to please his fancy.
How now? What do you here alone?
Do not you chide. I have a thing for you.
A thing for me? It is a common thing to have a foolish wife.
Is that all? What would you give me now for that same handkerchief?
What handkerchief?
What handkerchief? Why, that which the Moor first gave to Desdemona, that which so often you did bid me steal?
You stole it from her?
No, in faith. She let it drop by negligence, and to the advantage I being here took it up. Look, here it is.
Good wench, give it me.
What will you do with it that you have been so earnest to have me filch it?
Why, what's that to you?
Give me again. Poor lady, she shall run mad when she shall lack it.
I have a use for it. Go now, leave me.
So,
do we have time for questions? We got time for questions?
oh, good. Okay. All right. So, husband, can you take this off? Are we on? I think we're on.
We're off, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks. We've left them speechless. Oh.
I have a question for Nicole. As a control freak, what was it like to co-write a book with somebody else?
You know, actually, it's interesting. I think that that came along at the perfect time for me because executive functioning all the time is actually exhausting. And so the fact that Neil came to me and said, I have this idea for a book, whenever I want, but then he gave me so much latitude. I created most of the voices for it, and then he came along and batted cleanup. And so it was a perfect balance of having creative control in the creation of it, and then being able to hand it off to somebody else when I just was exhausted by the executive functioning. It's a long book. It's like 750 pages, so I was ready to share it. I'm a little intimidated by doing the sequel on my own because it's just me. And we work together really well. I mean, we have such completely different approaches to the process that once we figured out how to work together, it was kind of joyful. And really
He's an interesting guy for those who aren't familiar with his work. He mainly writes steampunky, speculative stuff, but he has another life as a futurist for Jeff Bezos.
We'll see what his future life as a futurist looks like now these days.
Somebody should have told them the future a bit more clearly, perhaps.
Nicole, totally
Yes.
aside from all of the interesting literary aspects, I'm over here.
Oh, hi.
I'm just curious, where does the fighter pilot fit into your timeline?
Right, so for those of you that don't have the errata and addendum page, my bio includes the fact that I was an X-Wing fighter pilot. When I was an actor, after the 3 original Star Wars movies came out, there was a CD-ROM made that was the first sort of thing that existed in the Star Wars universe that wasn't the 3 movies. And I was hired as an actor to be a fighter pilot that gets killed off eventually. I think you have to play through certain levels. But I'd forgotten about it, and then the fellow who directed it found a photo of me and put it on Facebook, and I was so tickled by it that I just decided to add it to my bio.
We have time for one more.
Is the lady here?
Hi, my name is Kathy, and I was an actor for many years too. I'm very curious about the kinds of day jobs that you had throughout your career.
At one point
Geraldine too, I'd be interested to know, as a aspiring journalist and writer, what kinds of day jobs can you tell us about?
My list will probably be longer than Geraldine's. At one point, I had 5 different jobs. I was a barista, I was a personal assistant, and then I worked for 3 different companies, HBO, Viacom, and then for an arts attorney doing critiquing stuff that came over the transom. I've also worked as a teacher, a copy editor, a freelance editor. I mean, most of the time I've been lucky, and it's had to do with working with text. But I definitely, the personal assistant for a person I'm not going to name was challenging. It was challenging.
I was really shy as a kid, and as you can see, I've got over that. But it was really a painful kind of shyness, and my mother gave me some good advice. She said, whatever it is you're afraid of, go and do it. So I actually, my day job was being an extra in TV commercials, and
Didn't know that.
and I got to be a rock climber, and I got to be a steer roping nun once. I still have the picture of myself in the habit, and it's a kind of flying nun habit. And it was kind of distressing because I realized how much I did look like all those Irish nuns that helped. But I was a housekeeper, and I loved waitressing. I waitressed in about 10 or 15 different restaurants, and I really enjoyed it. I liked the speed of it. I liked learning from the crazy chefs and dodging the knives when they're in a bad mood, and yeah, just learning how to reduce a stock and make a sauce, and I liked helping people have a good time. So, and if writing ever fails me, I think I'll become a dog walker.
I completely blanked on that part of my life. I was a waitress, but I don't think I enjoyed it as much as Geraldine did.
Well, of course, I was doing it in Australia where you actually get paid to do it, which helps.
Yeah, that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.